Before we get on with the podcast, I'd like to mention that I now have 3 books for sale on Kindle. Recommended Reading for the True Conservative, Bad Democrat, and now Evil Liberal. All available for $3.99 or through Kindle Unlimited. Now, on with the podcast.
You know it, your kids fucked up. My little nephew came in the house the other day, me and my brother, we were playing pool. He came in, he said, hey, Dad, what's the difference between a hypothetical question and a realistic question? Well, you know, my brother, he kind of stupid too, you know. Go upstairs and ask your mother, will she make love to the mailman for $250,000? My nephew ran upstairs, came back 10 minutes later. He said, Daddy, Mama said she'll fuck the mailman, the milkman, and any other man for $250,000. He said, well, son, go downstairs and ask your sister, will she make love to the next door neighbor for $250,000? Came back 15 minutes later and said, Father, sister said she'll fuck the next door neighbor, the neighborhood, and the next block for $250,000. My brother looked at me, I looked at him. Tell him, man, tell him. He said, let me tell you something. Son, hypothetically speaking, we should have $500,000. He said, but realistically speaking, son, we living with two hoes.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Rules Saturday, August the 8th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch and rules for retrogrades. All that and more when I get back. God, give us the grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it. Trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
The man of system is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He goes on to establish it completely and in all its parts without any regard either to the great interest or to the strong prejudices which may oppose it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces upon the chessboard have no other principal emotion besides that which the hand impresses upon them, but that in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislator might choose to impress upon it. If those two principles coincide and act in the same direction, the game of human society will go on easily and harmoniously and is very likely to be happy and successful. If they are opposite or different, the game will go on miserably, and the society must be at all times in the highest degree of disorder. Adam Smith. There is nothing I could say to improve on this mastery.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. The average person can tolerate being called out. They may be defensive at first, but eventually reflection is possible. The liberal, on the other hand, has structured their entire sense of self around denial. To name their behavior is to attack the very foundation of that false identity. That's why they react so intensely. Not necessarily because the naming is inaccurate, but because it is accurate. Accuracy is their enemy. Clarity is a threat. Specific words are dangerous. Terms like manipulation, coercion, or emotional abuse are like fire to the liberals' paper-thin reality. Those words carry weight. They describe patterns that others can recognize. And once that pattern is recognized, the liberal loses power. They count on our silence and our hesitation. They expect us to internalize the discomfort and not speak up. They exploit our uncertainty. But when we turn that uncertainty into language, when we give the behavior a name, we are no longer playing their game. We're playing our own. We're operating from awareness, not confusion, and awareness is contagious. When we label their tactics, not only do we wake ourselves up, but we also often wake others up too. The liberal knows this. This is why they become angry, dismissive, or mocking when confronted. It's a panic response. We've taken something that was hidden and put it into the open. Naming the behavior does something else. They can no longer pretend it's something else. If we call out their passive-aggressive sarcasm as a form of hostility, they can't hide behind humor anymore. If we point out that their concern is really control, they lose the ability to reframe it as care. That's what liberals are always doing, reframing. They take selfishness and call it strength. They take cruelty and call it honesty. They take control and call it love. But when we name what it actually is, we prevent that framing. We lock the behavior into place, and that forces a moment of accountability. Even if it's brief, there's a psychological shift that happens the first time someone names a liberal's behavior. It sends a signal that the dynamic has changed. The liberal no longer holds all the definitions. They no longer get to say what reality is. And this is where fear begins to creep in for them. Not the kind of fear that shows on the surface, but a deeper internal unease. They realize that they're no longer a complaint. We are no longer a complaint audience. We've started to see behind the performance. We've begun to tell the truth out loud. And truth, when spoken clearly, has a way of echoing once it's out. It doesn't go back in. This is why liberals work so hard to confuse language. They twist definitions. They accuse others of the very things they're doing. They flood conversations with circular logic, emotional baiting, and endless digressions. The goal is to exhaust you so you stop trying to make sense of things. But when we name the behavior directly, we cut through that fog. We stop engaging on their terms. We use clarity as resistance. We stay focused while they spin, and eventually they realize they've lost their grip. We don't need to argue or justify once we've named what's happening. The strength is in naming itself. When we say, "You're trying to guilt trip me into doing what you want," we've made the tactic visible. We've brought the unconscious into the conscious, and that removes its power. Liberal manipulation thrives in hiddenness. Language exposes it. Precision dismantles it. The more accurately we describe the behavior, the harder it becomes for the liberal to deny it or to continue it without consequence. This is why education is so powerful when dealing with liberals. When we understand the terminology, the tactics, and the psychological mechanisms, we no longer feel crazy. We no longer doubt our instincts. And more importantly, we can articulate what's happening. We can say it. That act alone, just putting it into words, is a form of liberation. It's also a form of threat from the liberals' point of view, because now we're no longer vulnerable to the fog. We've turned on the lights, and they don't know how to operate in full view. When we remain calm in the face of liberal provocation, we're doing something far more powerful than it may appear on the surface. We're disrupting the rhythm they rely on to maintain control. Liberals are experts in emotional manipulation. They know exactly which buttons to push to elicit a reaction. Their strength doesn't lie in logic, fairness, or reason. It lies in chaos. They live on volatility because it allows them to dominate the emotional landscape. But when we don't react, when we remain composed, we shift the entire dynamic. Suddenly, they are no longer orchestrating the scene. We are. Emotional reactivity is what liberals feed on. They provoke, we respond. They distort, we defend. They insult, we explain. It becomes a cycle of emotional energy where they are always at the center. But when we stop giving them that energy, when we respond with measured clarity, with grounded presence, they start to lose their footing. They rely on our emotional engagement to validate their importance, our upset, our anger, our confusion. All of it affirms to them that they matter, that they're in control, that they can still shape our internal state. Without that, they begin to panic in subtle and not so subtle ways. Staying calm in the presence of manipulation is not passive. It's one of the most active forms of resistance we can practice. It means we are choosing not to be baited. It means we are choosing not to let someone else dictate our emotional world. And to the narcissist, that's terrifying because their control relies on emotional dominance. If we stay calm, they can't escalate. If we stay calm, they can't turn the situation around on us. If we stay calm, they're left exposed, standing in the emotional storm they created alone. They may accuse us of being called heartless or unfeeling. This is a tactic. It's an attempt to pull us back into the drama, to provoke guilt or shame so we will break our calm. But this accusation reveals something deeper. Our emotional stability reminds them of their lack of it. Our refusal to be thrown off center mirrors their inability to stay grounded without controlling others. This internal contrast is unbearable for them. It highlights what they pretend not to know, that their dominance is hollow and the real power is quiet, internal, and self-governed. When we stay calm, we also rob the liberals of their favorite narrative, that we're the unstable ones. They often provoke us to the point of outburst and then point to that reaction as evidence of our irrationality or emotional instability. This is how they justify their own behavior, how they maintain a sense of superiority, and how they often deceive others. But when we don't give them that reaction, when we remain clear, centered, and emotionally neutral, they're left with nothing to weaponize. Their narrative crumbles, and the control they thought they had begins to slip away. It's important to understand that liberals aren't always conscious of what they're doing. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades.
Rule 6. Never compromise with radicals on their initiatives. Radicals work to implement the progressive agenda in increments. We can thus call their method incrementalism. There are a couple reasons for this. Were radicals to impose their disordered worldview all at once, it would prove so unnatural and dystopian that it would forever shatter the common man's perception of progressivism as a viable political philosophy. Since many of the ideas of radicals are so far out of the mainstream of Western convention, to avoid backlash, their ideas must be introduced slowly and methodically so as to gradually acclimate people to the brave new world, desensitizing them to its bitterness. Moreover, to hoodwink opposing political parties and to circumvent political resistance, radicals must advance their ideas slowly till such time as they achieve a critical mass, a tipping point at which their perverse ideas have taken root in the hearts and minds of the voting populace. Only then can their end game, their true vision, be revealed, insulated from the hazard of political consequence. Because incrementalism is at the nucleus of radicals' blueprint for capturing the culture, and because radicals are, at this point, the active principle driving cultural change, compromising on disputed issues invariably works in their favor. Consider, for instance, a debate on raising taxes. Let's imagine that a radical lawmaker floats the idea of a 90% federal income tax rate for top wage earners in order to ameliorate a budget deficit. Imagine, too, that one of the radical lawmakers' so-called moderate confrères retorts that a 90% income tax is unreasonable and proposes a mere 50% income tax. After some haggling, perhaps the lawmakers decide to compromise and agree on a 70% income tax rate for top earners. Suppose now that in ensuing years, irresponsible government spending yields yet another deficit. The same radical lawmaker, as is his habit, will again propose raising taxes in an effort to cure the deficit. Again, he will float the 90% income tax number. Again, the radicals' moderate confrère will balk at the 90% figure, but wanting to be reasonable and address the looming deficit, the moderate will this time propose splitting the difference and bringing the income tax rate up to a more palatable 80% rate. Should this cycle of punctuated creep be allowed to continue over time, the radical will eventually taste the 90% rate he had been clamoring for all along. Well, he could not have succeeded in having his demands met at first by working in increments, by appearing reasonable and settling for a series of upward ascending compromises. The radical has ultimately prevailed. A series of compromises inevitably leads to the active party achieving total victory, since with each successive compromise, the end goal is brought that much nearer. It should also be noted that radicals habitually use ground gained in previous victories as launching points for future attacks. When they make inroads through compromise, they use their forward momentum to springboard themselves to further conquests. Consider the issue of women clergy. Radicals can't simply demand that women immediately assume roles as high-ranking prelates in the church. They'd be laughed out of town. Such a change would be too drastic an overhaul, too severe a breach with timeless tradition to merit serious consideration. And radicals know this all too well. So they take a more cunning tack to achieve their goal. They complain that women are underrepresented in the church, and that in order to fully make use of women's surplus talents, they need more access to even modest positions of leadership and responsibility. As such, radicals may propose that women should have access to lower clerical positions, to the diaconate perhaps. And if, in an ill-conceived attempt to sate feminist lust for power, the church were to try to accommodate such demands and indulge radical women by appointing them deaconesses, It would be only a matter of time before radicals pointed to the deaconesses that had achieved a certain amount of renown or stature and pointedly inquire, why, since these women have fulfilled their lower clerical duties with such distinction and aplomb, should they be prohibited from acquiring the office of priestess? Pressing their advantage, they would put the church on the spot by asking the very questions whose unseemly answers were the impetus for its initial capitulation. In pressing their advantage in this way, radicals would continue to gain ground at an exponentially increasing pace. If this pattern were allowed to continue unabated, given the passage of enough time, eventually, women would attain the papacy. Radicals rely on incrementalism, and incrementalism thrives on a system of compromise. Hence, the retrograde must never compromise with the radical on a disputed issue. He must steadfastly refuse to give ground, gnashing his teeth before budging an inch. In this way, we can blunt the advance of radicalism and begin to make our own headway in the culture wars.
And that was Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy J. and David R. Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Stuart Varney with a guest.
The moderate Democrat group Third Way is planning a $15 million effort to discredit democratic socialism. Florida gubernatorial candidate Byron joins me now. Congressman, is the establishment now at war with the socialists?
Maybe. We'll see. But the truth is that the Democrat Party has been playing footsie with these socialists for a very long time. They've been actually working with them to build support to win campaigns. And now all of a sudden, they realize that socialism is soundly rejected by the voters of America, and they're trying to reverse course. And people need to also remember, the Democrat establishment is radical. It's the same establishment that opened our borders, created the highest inflation that America has seen in almost 50 years. They were destroying foreign policy left and right. This is the same Democrat establishment that had to abandon our ambassador residences across the globe. I mean, it's terrible policy from the Democratic left, and now they're mad at the socialists. Well, let's just be very clear. Whether it's the DSA or the Democrat establishment, they're both incredibly radical and have terrible policies that have actually made life significantly harder for the American people.
Okay, so Byron Donalds gets this all wrong. This is a psychological ploy. All this DSA nonsense is about punishing the electorate, punishing you and me for voting for Donald Trump. That's what this is all about. So all these DSA types that all of a sudden come to the fore, it's, again, a way of saying, okay, you voted for Donald Trump, this is your punishment. So the third way, and what the DSA is really saying to the Democrats is that we are willing to destroy the party in order to destroy Donald Trump. The people for the third way say, no, we have better ideas. We want to save the party, and we don't need to destroy it in order to defeat Donald Trump. That's the way they should look at it. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Mossad.
Sana'a, December 2007. On the shoulder of Jabal Atan, above the southern edge of the city, a concrete villa stood inside a rendered wall 4 meters high, with a guard hut at each of its 2 gates. 70 armed men worked the wall in shifts, and the standing order said every vehicle in or out was opened and searched to the frame. Nobody had failed that order for almost 2 years. One vehicle had been waved through the vehicle gate twice a week for 4 years running, because there is a limit to what a man will do to keep his job, and this was Operation Silage. Welcome to Operation Insights with Daniel. If you like the tradecraft as much as the outcome, subscribe, because that is where this one lives. Sana'a sits in a high mountain bowl at 2,218 meters, ringed by the Sarawat Range. The old walled city holds 7,000 tower houses and 56 residential quarters, each traditionally centered on a mosque, a bathhouse, and an endowed garden. But the city has been spilling out of its old walls into new districts of stepped concrete villas and rendered courtyards. On the southern shoulder of the city, above the affluent quarter of Hatta, rises Jabal Atan, the flank mountain whose lower slopes carry the residential neighborhood of Fajatan. It is a district of sheet metal gates and views back down over the bowl. On one of those stepped plots, in the second week of December 2007, stood a villa the guards inside it had come to think of as the wall, and the wall had come to think of as the man. The man was Nabil al-Muhtadi, mid-50s. Born inside the country, he now could not move around freely. Extended residence in the Levant and the Horn of Africa across the 1990s. Weapons pipeline coordinator for a network that no service in the region acknowledged existed. His kunya, the name the household used for him, was Abu Yassin, father of Yassin, the eldest of 2 sons who had grown up and left. His face was known in 2 capitals to services that would not name it aloud, and it had not been recorded on any published passport stamp for 22 months. He had not walked outside the compound wall in the same 22 months. In the last decade of the 20th century, he had lived in the open, moving between the Levant and the coast of the Horn on a working passport, and had come home a decade later without one that any border on earth would honor. The move behind the wall in Fajatan had been a slow retreat, rather than a single decision. 3 houses in 3 years, each smaller, and each further out of town, and the last of them was the one that no longer opened its gate for its owner to leave. The compound was not a fortress by choice. It was a fortress by necessity, and everyone inside it understood the difference. The household ran on the arithmetic of a man who cannot leave. His wife, his widowed sister, 2 servants and a cook. 2 grown sons abroad in cities their father would never see again. A private doctor who came twice a month with a small leather bag. A tailor who came 4 times a year with a book of swatches. A butcher's boy who left parcels at the pedestrian door beside the vehicle gate. The gate opened on any given day for perhaps 3 vehicles the household had asked for, and it opened twice a week for one vehicle nobody in particular had asked for, and nobody in the household could do without, because the compound sat above the piped sewer network of the city and the World Bank-funded project that had been extending that network across Sana'a since the turn of the decade had not yet reached this shoulder of the hill. Every household in Fajatan that lived above the network needed a private vacuum tanker to empty the cesspit under its courtyard. Al-Muhtadis did too. The service arrived every Wednesday and every Sunday, without fail, for 4 years. The detail was 70 men, not 50, not 100, 70 on the household payroll, drawn from a Sarawat flank district that had sent its sons into private protection work for a decade and a half. They rotated in 3 shifts a day, 23 on the wall, and its 2 gates at any given hour. with a reserve half-shift on call in a bunkhouse behind the villa's kitchen wing. They carried personal weapons issued from a household armory that al-Muhtadi's wife's cousin kept the key to. Their chief was Ali Salih al-Audi, a tribal figure in his early 50s, salaried by the household, not the state, and the man who wrote the standing order the whole wall lived by. The order was 2 typed pages in the small, windowless room the chief used as an office off the ground floor courtyard. It read like the standing order of a professional service, because a private household of this size in Yemen could afford to hire tribal protection men who had trained on state paperwork, and Alaudi wrote what he knew. Every vehicle in or out of either gate was opened and searched to the frame. Every crew member was checked at the pedestrian door, and identification cards were held by the guard hut for the duration of any visit. Equipment was visually inspected on entry and again on exit. The vehicle was walked around by a guard with a mirror on a pole. Where a vehicle carried liquid, the manhole cover of the courtyard cesspit was raised in the presence of 2 guards, one at the truck's cabin and one at the pump. The order did not exempt any category of vendor. The order did not use the word trust once. It is worth pausing on this, because a standing order of that grade, written by a man of that grade, is not the standard practice of a private detail anywhere in the region. It is the standard practice of a state Praetorian formation. In 2007, Yemen's own Republican Guard, commanded by the president's son Ahmed, was well-funded and Western-trained. The Ministry of Interior fielded roughly 50,000 personnel across its paramilitary formations, of which the Facilities Guard and VIP Protection Unit was one branch. Alaudi's 70 men were not any of these. They were private. They wore no state insignia. And yet the paperwork they lived by was Republican Guard grade paperwork, because the man who wrote it had learned it from the state and had chosen, out of professional pride and self-preservation, to write nothing less. The paperwork also had a second reason for being what it was. The compound had already survived, in the summer before the paperwork was written, an attempted approach by a delivery vehicle that Alaudi's men had turned away at the gate on nothing more than a wrong invoice number. The near miss became the standing order's foundation myth, retold to every new recruit inside a fortnight of joining, and for the first 2 years of its life, the paperwork and the practice matched everywhere it counted. And then, quietly, in the way these things always begin, the paperwork stopped matching the practice on one vehicle, and one vehicle only. On the northern industrial ribbon of the city, where the road out to the airport passes light industrial plots of workshops and welded steel yards, a small licensed sanitation firm had been registered in the summer of 2005. It traded as Sandwaste. Its legal name on the ministry roll was Sana Environmental Services. It operated 3 vacuum tankers on Isuzu chassis, each with a rated capacity of 10,000 liters. It kept a workshop with a pit for oil changes, a small office of 2 desks and 2 telephones, and a paper filing system for its dockets. It held current municipal licenses for tanker operation, for the storage of pumped waste at an authorized discharge site east of the city, and for the disposal of the small volumes of used oil its own workshop generated. On paper and in the yard, it was indistinguishable from a dozen other small operators in the sector. Its managing director was a Yemeni businessman named Munir Fadli, who had answered a discreet advertisement in a Gulf trade paper in the spring of 2005. He had been offered the running of a well-capitalized small firm by a Gulf trading house that wished, for its own reasons, to hold the license through a nominee. Fadli was a competent man with a family and a mortgage. He had worked for 6 years in a supply chain role at a cement distributor and knew how to read a docket, price a route, and keep 3 drivers on the road without any of them killing themselves. He met the offered salary with visible relief. He did not know that he did not, in any real sense, own the firm he ran. He did not know that the trading house behind him did not, in any real sense, exist. He knew only that the invoicing was timely, that his salary cleared on the 1st of every month, that his working capital never once dipped below 30 days of payroll, and that his largest single customer was a household in Fajatan whose driver he had never met. The ownership behind Sandwaste routed through a Gulf trading house whose director, for the purposes of a file no employee in Sana'a would ever read, went by the codename Merchant. The trading house was itself a nominee-held entity, incorporated in a jurisdiction that neither taxed nor examined it. Its stated business was the wholesale distribution of general industrial components across the Gulf, a boring, plausible trade with real invoices, real containers, and real customers. The line from Merchant back to a certain building in Tel Aviv passed through 3 further jurisdictions and a small chain of natural persons, of whom only one was aware of the destination of the chain. This is the standard shape of a long-led commercial front. It is not glamorous work. It takes years of ordinary trading, ordinary invoicing, and ordinary staff before it is ever used operationally. Sandwaste had been standing up for 28 months before anyone touched the docket that mattered. That is the operation actually beginning. On a parcel adjacent to al-Muhtadi's compound, in a 2-story villa the household had never taken any interest in, a first-floor room had been rented in June of 2006 by a foreign national engineer who kept polite hours and paid his rent in cash. The engineer was not an engineer. He was the in-country lead of the operation that would become Silage, and his codename inside station was Wolf. From that window, and from a second window at the back of the same flat, an observation post ran continuously for 18 months. Its case officer, running the file from station under the codename Ibex, never once set foot in the district. The intelligence product the post built was not the target. It was the wall. The post logged the number of guards on each shift and how many rotated at each shift change. It logged the fasting hours through 2 consecutive Ramadans, when the discipline of the wall visibly shifted in the last hour before sunset. It logged the cot hour, when the household's own tempo went slack from mid-afternoon, and the walls did too, 1 degree behind. It logged the 2-meter stretch of ground between the pedestrian door and the tanker's own curbside stop, where the tanker crew alone was searched. And, week by week, it logged what happened along that stretch of ground when the tanker arrived. In the first 3 months, the search was thorough. The guard walked the vehicle with a mirror on a pole. The pump hand's identification was held. The equipment rack was inspected. By the 6th month, the mirror had stopped coming out. By the 9th, the equipment rack was inspected on entry and waved through on exit. By the 12th, the pump hand's identification was still handed over, but the guard often did not read the second page. By the 18th, the tanker was cleared for entry with a nod and a wave from a distance of 5 meters, the guard already stepping back from the smell, the docket signed in the guard hut without the vehicle being walked around at all. This decay is not a training video. It is a documented failure mode of long-tenure private protection worldwide. The professional literature calls it the familiarity gap. Guards who have waved a vehicle through 400 times without incident stop searching it in any meaningful sense. The gap is largest on the vehicle nobody wants to spend a minute longer with than necessary. It is why the same literature advises households to rotate their vendors on a fixed schedule and to rotate the identity of who searches what within a shift. And it is why Al-Audi's own standing order had exactly one weakness, which was that Al-Audi did not believe the weakness could exist inside a detail. He had trained himself. By the 18th month of the observation post, Silage had all it needed. The clock was no longer waiting on the wall. The clock was waiting on a Sunday. The small Hada office of Sandwaste held a green metal filing cabinet against the wall, furthest from the window. In the top drawer were 4 years of paper dockets from a single customer address in Faj Atan, filed by month, held in cardboard folders tied with cotton tape. In the summer of 2007, Wolf and a station analyst spent 4 consecutive afternoons in that office, in the cover of an audit visit signed off by Munir Fadli, who did not know what he was signing off on and did not think to ask. The auditors, on paper, worked for the Gulf trading house that owned Fadli's firm. Fadli made them coffee, pointed them at the cabinet, and returned to his own desk to file the invoices for the previous week. The dockets were an intelligence product no observation post could ever generate. Each docket recorded the date and time of the service call, the volume pumped in liters, the pump hand's initials, the driver's initials, and one small handwritten note on the state of the tank at arrival. Read in sequence across 4 years, the dockets told the story of a household's routine in a language the household itself did not know it was writing. The dockets said two operationally decisive things. First, the compound's cesspit was fullest on Tuesdays, so Wednesday's morning call was always the longer of the two, 40 minutes on average against 28 for the Sunday call. This was consistent with a household of 11 people whose weekly rhythm included communal Friday and Saturday meals, and it meant that any operational visit would have to fit inside the shorter of the two calls, at Sunday's pumping speed and Sunday's guard bearing, not Wednesday's. Second, the household did nothing on the Sunday morning that would explain a pattern the observation post had already noticed and could not fit anywhere else. On 6 Sunday mornings in 6 consecutive weeks, between the 20th of May and the 24th of June, a single figure in a light robe had walked the perimeter of the courtyard between 08:35 and 08:42 hours, in the company of a second figure that moved with the shoulder carriage of a bodyguard. On the 7th Sunday, they repeated it. And on the 8th, they repeated it again. This was the target. And this was the window. The observation post confirmed the walk once, twice, 6 weeks in a row, and then twice a week more into July for insurance. The dockets confirmed, in Fadley's own filing cabinet, that the Sunday call had never once run under 22 minutes in 4 years, so 28 minutes at the manhole was not a stretch and would draw no comment. The window was not a moment. It was a Sunday, mid-morning at pumping speed. In the 28 minutes, the tanker was already scheduled to be inside the wall. The regular San Luis crew for the Fajatan address was a driver in his 40s, named for the docket only by his initials, and a pump hand in his 20s, whose name likewise appeared only in a shorthand column. Both were local Yemeni employees. Both were blameless. Neither was ever spoken to about the address or the household. In the second week of December 2007, the driver's brother married in a village outside the city, and the driver took the customary week of wedding leave from the Wednesday before the ceremony to the Wednesday after. This was an authentic event in an authentic family. Its date, however, had been quietly arranged 12 weeks earlier through a cousin's employer who was in another chain a foreign service also owned. SanWest dispatched a floater crew for the week. A floater crew is what a small firm sends when a regular crew is on leave, holiday cover, sickness, or a shift juggle. The two men who arrived at Fadley's yard on the Sunday morning of the second week of December had been on SanWest's payroll since June. They had run 29 service calls between them across the summer and autumn, on a rotation across the firm's other customer addresses that had built them a working record any auditor would have credited. They were competent tanker crew because they had been trained as competent tanker crew, and they were on the payroll because a payroll floater on paper is a payroll floater in law. Their code names inside station were Kite and Otter. Kite was the pump hand for the call. Otter was at the wheel. The complication almost derailed the operation before it left the yard. At 07:45 hours, Wolf's observation post radioed that Al-Audi had rotated 2 men on the wall early because one of them was on medical leave. The Sunday shift that arrived at 07:30 was not the Sunday shift the model had built its confidence on. Ibex, running the operation from station, held the tanker at the yard. For 18 minutes, the operation was 1 word away from stand-down. Kite and Otter sat with the engine off, the tanker facing the yard's open gate, the dockets on the clipboard already stamped for the morning's route. The observation post radioed again at 083. The reserve pair had settled onto the wall, and their bearing was, if anything, less alert than the roster they had replaced, because the reserve pair worked Wednesdays and Sundays only, and treated the Sunday morning as an easier watch than the pair they had covered for did. Ibex released the tanker at 087. Otter drove out of the yard at 089. The tanker rolled through the airport road ribbon, into Hada, up the last of the switchback that climbs the shoulder of Jabal Atan, and reached the vehicle gate of the compound at 0819 hours. The vehicle gate opened at 0821 hours. The docket was presented at the guard hut. The pump hand's identification card was handed across the plywood shelf that ran the length of the hut window and returned 2 seconds later without being turned over. The guard on gate duty stepped back into the shade of the hut roof, glanced at the hose visible in the vehicle's side rack, and waved the tanker forward with the back of his hand. The mirror on a pole rested against the inside wall of the hut, where it had rested every Wednesday and Sunday morning since the autumn of 2006. 0822. The tanker crossed the courtyard at walking pace and halted over the flush cast-iron cover set into the concrete surround, 25 meters from the door Al-Muhtadi used to reach the household's private car. Otter set the handbrake, dismounted, and unrolled the suction hose across the surface of the courtyard. Kite raised the manhole cover with a T-bar, checked the depth of the sludge with a marked rod, and coupled the suction end into the mouth of the pit. Otter engaged the pump takeoff from the cabin. At 0824, the pump was running at working speed. A vacuum tanker's pump at working speed is loud. The engine sits at a raised idle to drive the takeoff. The pump itself has its own scream, half a whistle and half a saw. The hose whips at each surge and slaps against its own coupling. For the 28 minutes that follow, the pump is the loudest thing in the courtyard. It covers the sound of small mechanical work, and it covers the sound of ordinary human movement at close range. It does not cover conversation, and it does not cover shouting, but the two men inside the wall neither shouted nor spoke. Kite worked at the manhole in the plain field of the guard on the courtyard side, who stood at the wall of the villa in the shade with his rifle at his hip. Kite's back was turned to the guard for 2/3 of the call, which was normal and expected on any service call anywhere in the region. The pump hand's operational envelope for the visit was defined and rehearsed. He had one place in the courtyard he was permitted to be, which was the manhole, and one interaction he was permitted to have with the household, which was to sign the docket at the guard hut on the way out. The toolbox in the cabin held one item that was not on any sand waste inventory, and that item was in the cabin, not in the tank. It was placed at 0836 in the 2-meter gap between the courtyard side guard's post and the corner of the villa's shaded wall. At a point, the guard's own line of sight did not cover from the position he had chosen for the shade. The interior cost of standing at the manhole for the second half of that call belonged to Kite, and he alone would ever describe it. It was, he said afterwards to Wolf in a station debrief, the file kept on the second shelf from the top, the discipline of not looking up. He had counted the liters on the pump gauge for 28 minutes without lifting his eyes from the dial, because the man he had come to kill was 30 meters behind him at a first-floor window from which the courtyard was clearly visible, and looking up at the window would have made him, for 1 second, the only man in the courtyard whose behavior did not match his cover. The cost was not the 28 minutes. The cost was the 6 months on the payroll before them, and the further weeks that would follow, in which he would remain a working pump hand on the roster of a small firm in Sana'a until his own quiet exit through an airport in a neighboring country. Kite disconnected the hose at 0848, rinsed the coupling, replaced the manhole cover, coiled the hose into the side rack, and signed the docket at the guard hut at 0850 hours. The tanker rolled out of the vehicle gate at 0851. For 20 minutes after the tanker left, the compound was quieter than usual, in the ordinary Sunday morning way that the household expected of the last hour, before Al-Muhtadi's cot visitors began to arrive. At 0911, from the observation post window across the road, Wolf saw the wife cross the courtyard from the kitchen wing to the household's private staircase at a pace faster than her usual. At 0914, Al-Audi crossed the same courtyard from his office at a pace that was not casual either. At 0917, the pedestrian door beside the vehicle gate opened, and a neighbor walked in with a small leather bag over her shoulder. She was a nurse, and she lived on the parcel below. She had been called into the compound 6 times in the previous 18 months for minor household emergencies and knew the family. The guards at the pedestrian door recognized her and did not open her bag. She had, on other visits, been the one who dressed a cook's cut hand, and the one who sat with the widowed sister through a bad night. On this visit, she made 2 telephone calls from the household's own line before she went upstairs. By 0922, the household doctor had been telephoned, and by 0940, a private car was at the pedestrian door to bring him. The doctor arrived at 10:10. He carried a bag the guards did not open, because they had never opened his bag on any of the 11 visits he had made in the previous year. In the observation post window across the road, Wolf watched the private car park, watched the doctor walk in, and closed the second of the 2 notebooks he had been keeping since June of the previous year. The operation had spent 18 months mapping a wall whose slowest process, as it now turned out in real time, was its emergency response. The doctor arrived 1 hour and 19 minutes after the pump had stopped. Al-Audi's standing order held not one paragraph on the sequence of steps to be taken from the moment the household called for a doctor, because it had not occurred to Al-Audi that the wall would ever need one on a Sunday morning. There is one target humanizing detail that the observation post's own logs preserved from the 6 weeks of confirmed Sunday walks, and it belonged to Al-Muhtadi. On the 4th of those Sundays, the observation post noted, the man in the light robe had crossed the courtyard from the villa door with a boy of perhaps 8 years old on his hip, who had been visiting from a sister-in-law's household in the city. He had walked the perimeter carrying the boy for the whole 7 minutes of his customary walk, pointing at the ridge of Jabal Atan and speaking to the child in a low voice the log could not hear. The boy was not one of his own sons. Those were the 2 who had grown up and left. The boy was the nephew he had not seen in 11 months. The observation post logged the boy in a single line, because logs are logs. The line sat in the folder Ibex closed at 10:10, one small human thing among the times and the distances. No claim followed. No communique appeared on any wall in the city. No state announcement of a death that day at that address in Sana'a made any newspaper the household's remaining relatives were likely to read. The official version of events, quietly circulated by the household's own remaining people in the days that followed, was that the master of the house had died of natural causes at home on a Sunday morning at his customary hour of prayer, and no relative and no neighbor publicly disputed the version, because none of them had any interest in doing so. On the following Wednesday, Sanwas's regular driver was back at work from his brother's wedding leave, and the Wednesday service call to the address in Faj Atan proceeded as usual, because a household does not stop generating what a private tanker exists to remove, and because a household still has a family, and a household still has a chief of the detail, who has been told to keep the compound running until the affairs of the estate are settled. The docket for that Wednesday's call is filed in the green cabinet in Fadli's Hada office to this day, with the volume pumped and the driver's initials in the columns and no note in the margin at all. Nothing about an event of this class is publicly claimed by any service that is capable of running one. The operational value of never being seen to have been there is greater than any operational value of being seen. The household dispersed over the following 4 months. The compound was sold in a private sale to a Gulf national buyer whose lawyer never entered the house. The 70-man detail was paid out in a lump sum severance the household's remaining relatives grumbled about, quietly, in private. Al-Audi opened a small security consultancy office in a different quarter of the city, and for the rest of his working life, wrote standing orders for other private households that were, if anything, even stricter than the standing order at Faj Atan had been. He never spoke publicly about the wall, because the wall had held. Sanwast kept running. Its 3 tankers continued to service the customer base Munir Fadli had grown across 3 years. Fadli's own salary continued to clear on the 1st of every month. In a Gulf trading house whose board changed twice in the following year, without any public reason ever being offered, one of its holdings also changed its board, likewise without reason. The chain from merchant back to a certain building in Tel Aviv was not dismantled. A commercial front that has spent 28 months becoming an ordinary firm is worth more as an ordinary firm than as a retired one. Sandwest is, on paper, still trading. It has not been used operationally again in the years since. Kite and Otter left the country separately, on separate paperwork, through separate airports in neighboring countries in the weeks that followed. Wolf remained in his rented flat across the road for a further 15 weeks, running a wind-down protocol that emptied the observation post so slowly that no landlord noticed a change in the tenants' habits. Weigh the two sides honestly, because both are here, and neither collapses the other. On one side of the scale is the intelligence case. A weapons pipeline coordinator inside a fortress is a fortress that has become a cage, and reaching him spared the streets outside a longer arithmetic. None of us can calculate now, because a life that does not appear on a page in any subsequent year is a life we cannot count. The operation cost nothing above its own expense. It killed no innocent. It did not injure a servant, a family member, or one of the 70 men on the wall. It reached a man whose reach could otherwise not be reached, using a vehicle everyone knew was there and nobody wanted to look at. On the other side sits the plain thing that also happened that Sunday morning. 70 men lost their employer, their wages, and the small daily standing that a private detail confers on the sons of a Sarawat flank district in a country that had precious little else to offer them. A regular tanker driver, on wedding leave in a village outside the city, returned to Sana'a on a Wednesday to a customer address where his employer was dead, and where his own colleagues quietly asked whether he had known, and, when he swore he had not, quietly kept asking. Munir Fadli continued to run a firm he had believed for 4 years he had built himself, and never learned what he had actually been the top of. A nephew of 8 remembered, for the rest of his life, the last time his uncle had carried him around the courtyard of a house that afterwards was sold to a stranger. The 70-man details chief, whose standing order was the pride of his professional life, went on writing standing orders for other households, and never told any of them that the one he had written for the wall at Fajatan had, in fact, held perfectly, until the day the compound behind it emptied of everything the order had been written to protect.
And that was the Mossad. Back in a minute. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no right.